Welcome to Sunday Morning Cafe, our ongoing dialogue about what builds resilience. Here's a shout out to the family and friends of my dear friend Tom Halinga, who has been a mentor to me. He died this last Wednesday. Tom was somebody who dispensed in his own way lots of wisdom about spiritual resilience. And the way it is that spirituality does justice and the doing of justice leads to deeper spirituality. Tom, I'm going to miss you. Thanks for everything you gave me. I'd like to talk about resilient relationships today, whether it's relationships with your sweetie or relationships with your sweet mate. And in particular, I want to really just do the humble thing of providing one tool when it comes to conflict management. Now, before I provide you that tool, I want to share something with you that I experienced in the 1980s when I was studying for my master's degree. I came across this research that one of the findings said that unhappy marriages are correlated with lots of honesty. I had to read that again. Honesty has something to do with bad marriages. That just seemed so counterintuitive to me until I read down into that result and discovered that what they were talking about was that thing that people say when they say, well, I just tell it like it is. In other words, brutal honesty. In all these years that I've done couples counseling, I'm less and less a fan of brutal honesty. But I'll tell you what, if you can do surgery and excise that brutality out of the honesty, and instead pair that honesty with like a compassionate intelligence and empathy, if you can mix empathy and compassionate intelligence with honesty, then you've got something that can lead to lifelong fidelity and intimacy, warmth, and resilience too. And so one part of that is knowing how to do conflict properly, how to get to my truth, how to get to that honesty with compassion and with kind of a compassionate intelligence and empathy. So it's time for me to talk about that tool. But before I talk about that tool, I want to talk about 3 things to do before you exercise the tool I'm going to talk about. The first thing is this: discernment. In these last 4 months, we've been sheltering in place as couples in relationships. And the surround that surrounds us and within us is a thing that's got anxiety in it, some fear in it. And there's a way in which that disquiet in us can just be seeking an object, and what better object is there than that partner of mine, to kind of put them in the crosshairs and let them have all that. So the discernment I'm talking about is to really sit down and think about, is this thing I want to discuss with my partner, is it a thing that really needs to be discussed? Or is it one of those things where we can let that recede into the background and let some of the appreciation move into the foreground? So that discernment is the first thing that's really important, because when it comes to this kind of stuff, discretion is the better part of valor. The other thing I want to recommend in that discernment is to find that person who is like a mentor who has some wisdom to them about relationships. It may be useful to rehearse what you want to say to your partner with that person to make sure that you've got the compassion included, the intelligence included, and the empathy included, and to really see, is this important enough for me to raise it? So discernment and having that mentor, real important. And people in my profession make pretty good mentors along those lines. Not all of us do, but some do. So to look for that person. The other thing I want to say is this, and this is very counterintuitive. The time that is least good to talk about your conflict is when you're in the middle of the experience that the conflict is about. I'll give you a for instance. If your conflict is about how it is that this partner of yours never does enough housework or frequently doesn't do enough housework, why, when you're just on your last nerve because they didn't do housework is not the time to raise it, because you need every bit of that prefrontal cortex, and you don't need to be in your brainstem. Let me put that a different way. You need every bit of that intelligent spirit of yours. You don't need to be speaking from your spleen. So letting that moment pass where the anger is and address it a little bit later when you have more of your reflectivity and your calmness to bring to the conversation. Okay, if you've satisfied those 3 criteria, now it's time to talk about the technique. And this is based on sound longitudinal research. The first 3% of what you do in your relationship conflict will determine the next 97% of what's going to happen. And so what my colleague John Gottman says is go into your conflict letting your partner know about your complaint by softening up the startup, the first 3% of what you're going to say. And by softening up the startup, all I mean is this: say something generous, say something kind, say something loving to your spouse. And here's the thing, mean it. Because if you don't mean it, it's nothing more than a manipulative technique. But if you mean it, like it really is heartfelt, then you proceed forward and see what happens. And so, for instance, check this out. If I go to my spouse and say, would it kill you to initiate romance? I'm always the one initiating romance. That first 3%, you kind of know what's going to happen. Hearing aids get turned down, it doesn't go well. It's met with defensiveness. But if I walk in like this, you do so much for me. I mean, for goodness sakes, you bring me a cup of coffee when I don't even ask it. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. You do so much kindness for me. There is an area, though, I want to discuss with you. Check out that softened startup. That's got much more of a chance of going forward. Here's another way to do the startup to a conflict that enhances your chances of getting someplace new with it. This is PhD level stuff now. Ready? Think about when your spouse has actually successfully done the thing you're going to ask for, and remind them of it by voicing your gratitude. So watch this. Do you remember, I think it was our anniversary, not all that long ago, where I came home and you had a bottle of wine open and there were candles? That meant so much to me. Do you think you could do that again pretty soon? Check that out. I'm helping my spouse remember a success at this. I'm voicing appreciation for it. I'm asking her to replicate that. You're already good at this. I'm just asking you to do it again. And by the way, when a spouse gets to that thing that you complained about, you want to notice that and you want to comment on it by savoring and appreciating that good thing. So that's the technique. Not very complicated, is it? Now, what I want to say though, I'm going to give you a warning to this technique. Whenever you step in to do voice a complaint, to do conflict with that kind of intentionality, that kind of compassion and empathy, know that you're likely going to hear something that will call you to change and grow. You're likely to hear something where you might have played a part in that conflict and you weren't aware of it. So the state of mind you want to have as you go into this, I think is summarized nicely in that thing called the peace prayer that's been attributed to St. Francis. Let me quote it a little bit. Make me an instrument of your peace. Check out what it doesn't say. Make my spouse an instrument of your peace, and then I'll be an instrument of peace for them. It doesn't say that, does it? The prayer goes on. Where there's hatred, let me sow love. Notice what it doesn't say. Where there's hatred, let my spouse bring some love, and then I'll bring the love. It's unilateral. It seems to say, I'm fixing to take care of my side of the street and to bring that forward. The sense of that prayer, the peace prayer, is seeking the truth together in love. The kicker, the line in there that I'd really like you to look at is, grant that I might not so much seek to be understood as to understand. To go into it with, I really want to understand even more than I want to be understood. So if you just put into your search engine St. Francis's Peace Prayer, you'll see this. And see if by making that part of your spirituality, you don't find yourself approaching not just the relationship with your partner, but other relationships that way as well. Very resilient prayer. All right. That's all we have for this week. I'll see you next week as we continue our ongoing talk about building resilience in our relationships and within ourselves.